Camping in the heart of the wilderness can be a serene escape, just you, the stars, and the tranquil sounds of nature. But sometimes, the very forest that promises peace and solitude can harbor chilling secrets. This is the true story of a group of friends who ventured deep into the woods and uncovered a nightmare they never saw coming. It was supposed to be a weekend getaway, a fun camping trip planned by three close friends, Zoe, Jake, and Tyler. They found a secluded spot, miles away from any town, far from the beaten paths and campsites, the perfect place to disconnect from their busy lives. Or so they thought. Everything was going great at first. The trio spent the day hiking, telling stories, and roasting marshmallows over the fire. As night fell, the atmosphere changed, the forest felt more oppressive, and the laughter gradually faded, but they chalked it up to nerves. After all, they were miles away from anyone, and the laughter gradually faded, but they chalked it up to nerves. After all, they were miles away from anyone. It was around midnight when the first strange noise broke through the silence. A snapping twig, but it wasn't the ordinary sound of an animal moving through the brush. It was deliberate, as if something or someone was lurking just out of sight, watching. They dismissed it at first, reassuring themselves it was just a deer or maybe a raccoon. But, as the minutes passed, the noises grew more persistent: twigs snapping, rustling leaves, low murmurs carried by the wind. It was as if the forest itself had come alive. It was as if the forest itself had come alive, whispering in languages they couldn't understand. I could have sworn I heard footsteps ... like someone walking in circles around our campsite. But every time I looked, there was nothing there, just darkness. But that wasn't all. Zoe began feeling as if they weren't alone. A presence she couldn't quite describe, a cold, menacing energy that seemed to be closing in on them. Unable to shake the tension, the group decided to call it a night and retreated into their tents. That's when things took a terrifying turn. Zoe was suddenly jolted awake by a scratching noise, like fingernails scraping against fabric. She froze, listening intently. The sound wasn't coming from the trees. It was right outside her tent. Jake and Tyler heard it too: slow, deliberate scratching, followed by a low, inhuman growl. It was then that the realization hit them. Whatever was out there wasn't an animal. It was something far more sinister. In the pitch-black darkness, they saw them shadowy figures standing just beyond the campfire's dying embers. The figures were motionless, their eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. They appeared to be humanoid but distorted, with long, twisted limbs and hollow faces, and they were getting closer. With their hearts racing, they made a split-second decision: they had to get out of there. Grabbing whatever they could carry, the friends bolted out of their tents and sprinted through the forest, not daring to look back. As they ran, they could hear the whispers getting louder, closer. The distorted voices seemed to call their names, urging them to stop and turn around. But they didn't dare. They ran until their legs gave out, collapsing when they finally reached the edge of the forest where their car was parked. Shaking and out of breath, they jumped into the car and sped away. The shadowy figures were nowhere to be seen, but the chilling sense that they had narrowly escaped something beyond comprehension lingered. When the group finally made it back to civilization, they couldn't shake the dread that followed them. To this day, none of them can explain what they encountered that night. Was it some ancient presence in the forest, a shared hallucination, or something else entirely? All they know is that it was real, and it's an experience they'll never forget. So, the next time you plan a camping trip deep in the woods, remember, you might not be as alone as you think. The forest holds many secrets ... some better left undiscovered. If you enjoyed this story, be sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more chilling true tales. And as always, sleep tight. Story number 2. Steve had always been an experienced hiker, used to solo trips in remote locations. This time, he chose a trail far from the usual tourist spots, an isolated path deep in the Appalachian Mountains. With a few days' worth of supplies and a sturdy tent, he planned to spend the weekend disconnected from the world. But he wasn't the first one to attempt this trail, and not everyone who did made it back. After several hours of hiking, Steve found the perfect spot to set up camp near a small clearing, surrounded by towering trees. As night fell, he noticed something strange. There were no sounds, no crickets, no rustling leaves, nothing, just an eerie, heavy silence that seemed to press in on him. Shrugging it off as paranoia, he got a fire going and tried to relax. But the silence only deepened, and an unsettling feeling began to gnaw at the back of his mind. That's when he first noticed something moving in the distance, just out of the firelight's reach. It was too dark to make out any details, but Steve saw enough to know it wasn't an animal. The shape was human. He called out, thinking it might be another hiker who got lost. But there was no response, just the sound of leaves crunching underfoot as the figure moved deeper into the woods. Steve couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching him. The minutes ticked by, stretching into hours, and the woods seemed to close in around him. Every time he tried to relax, there was a rustle in the brush, a twig snapping nearby. But whenever he shined his flashlight in that direction, there was nothing there. Finally, exhaustion took over, and he retreated into his tent, convincing himself it was just his imagination playing tricks on him. But deep down, he knew something wasn't right. And that night, his worst fears came to life. Steve woke to the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling his tent. The sound was too close, almost as if it was right on top of him. His mind raced, but he couldn't move, frozen in fear. Then, something brushed against the fabric of his tent, a light, dragging motion, like fingers tracing along the material. His heart pounded as he tried to rationalize what was happening. Maybe it was a bear, but bears don't walk upright, and they certainly don't circle tents like this. Whatever was out there was playing with him. For what felt like an eternity, the creature or person stayed outside his tent, pacing, scratching, and whispering in a low, gravelly voice that sent shivers through his body. The words were impossible to understand, but the malice behind them was unmistakable. Steve whispering, "Please go away, please go away." When the sun finally rose, Steve mustered the courage to peek outside. The clearing was empty, no tracks, no signs of anyone or anything having been there. But just as he was packing up to leave, he saw a symbol etched into the dirt, right where the footsteps had been. It wasn't a random mark, it was deliberate, almost ritualistic. Steve didn't wait to figure out what it meant. He grabbed his gear and hightailed it out of there, not stopping until he reached the trailhead and his car. Even after reaching safety, Steve couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had found him in the woods was still with him, lurking in the shadows. To this day, he refuses to talk about that trip in detail, only mentioning that he felt like he was being hunted. And he swore he could still hear the whispers in his dreams. Some places are better left unexplored, their secrets buried in the darkness. So, if you ever find yourself deep in the woods, alone and far from civilization, just remember, you might not be the only one out there. Story number 2. Camping is meant to bring us closer to nature, to escape the rush of modern life and enjoy the peaceful solitude of the wilderness. But sometimes, that isolation can reveal horrors that were never meant to be disturbed. This is the true story of two friends who encountered something unnatural in the forest, something that should never have been there. Emily and Sarah had been planning their weekend camping trip for weeks. Both seasoned campers, they wanted a challenge, so they chose a remote spot deep in the national forest, far from any designated campsites. They weren't afraid of the wilderness. In fact, they loved the idea of being completely alone with nature. They arrived at their chosen campsite, miles from the nearest road or trail. The area was perfect, beautiful, secluded, and completely silent. They spent the evening cooking over the fire and telling stories, feeling entirely at peace. But that peace would be short-lived. As the night grew darker, the forest around them seemed to change. The air became colder, and an uncomfortable stillness settled in. It was the kind of silence that felt unnatural, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Sarah was the first to notice it's something moving in the shadows. At first, she thought it was just her eyes playing tricks on her. But then, she saw it again, what looked like a person standing far off in the trees, barely visible in the darkness. She nudged Emily, pointing in that direction. But when they both looked, the figure was gone. They tried to laugh it off, convincing themselves it was just a trick of the light, maybe even a deer or some other animal. But deep down, they both felt that something wasn't right. They decided to call it a night, hoping some sleep would shake off the eerie feeling. Hours passed, but neither of them could fall asleep. Every rustle of leaves, every creak of the trees set their nerves on edge. Then, just past midnight, they heard a faint but distinct sound coming from just outside their tent. It was the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and too heavy to be an animal. Emily and Sarah froze, listening as the footsteps circled their tent. The sound stopped directly in front of the entrance. Then, in the dead of night, they heard something even more chilling, a voice. It was barely more than a whisper, but they could make out the words, "Help me. I'm lost." The voice sounded broken, like someone desperate and in pain. But there was something off about it. It didn't sound quite human. Emily whispering, "Do we help them? Maybe someone's really hurt out there." Sarah shaking her head. "No. Something's wrong. We should stay quiet." The voice kept pleading, repeating the same words, over and over. "Help me. I'm lost." But no matter how long they listened, it never got any closer or farther away. It was as if it was stuck in place, a broken record looping endlessly. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. They waited in silence, their hearts pounding, too terrified to even peek outside. Minutes passed, then an hour. But there was nothing, no footsteps, no voice. It was as if whatever had been out there had simply vanished. When the sun finally rose, they cautiously stepped out of their tent, expecting to find signs of someone who might have needed help. But there was nothing, no footprints, no sign of anyone passing through. The ground was undisturbed, as if no one had been there at all. Shaken, they decided to pack up and leave as quickly as possible. But as they gathered their gear, Sarah noticed something that made her blood run cold. Just a few yards away, at the edge of the clearing, was another campsite, a single, old, tattered tent, half collapsed and covered in dirt and moss. It looked like it had been there for a long time. Curious but cautious, they approached the tent, calling out in case someone might still be around. But as they got closer, they realized the truth. This tent hadn't been used in years. The inside was empty, except for a few rotting supplies and a torn sleeping bag. Suddenly, it all made sense. The voice they had heard in the night, pleading for help, was coming from this spot. But how could that be? There was no one here, and there hadn't been for a long time. Without saying another word, they grabbed their gear and hiked back to the trailhead, not stopping until they reached their car. To this day, neither of them can explain what they experienced. Was it a spirit, forever trapped in that spot, doomed to repeat its final moments, or was it something darker, mimicking a human voice to lure them into danger? One thing's for sure, whatever it was, it didn't belong in our world. So, if you ever find yourself deep in the woods, far from civilization, and you hear a voice in the dark calling out for help, think twice before you answer. Some cries are best left unheard. Story number 3. For many, camping is an escape, a chance to unplug and find peace in nature. But the deeper you go into the woods, the thinner the line becomes between our world and something else. This is the story of a group of campers who ventured into the pines for a weekend of fun, only to find something terrifying lurking in the shadows. Jake and his friends were no strangers to the outdoors. They'd camped together dozens of times, but this trip was special. They had heard rumors about an old, abandoned cabin deep in the forest, hidden off the main trails. The local legends said it was cursed, that those who stayed there never came back the same. But the group brushed it off as just stories to scare kids. After a long hike, they decided to set up camp for the night, planning to explore the area the next day. They pitched their tents near a thick grove of pine trees, where the branches seemed to twist in unnatural shapes. But despite the eerie surroundings, the group was in good spirits, joking around as they gathered firewood and cooked dinner. Lisa was the first to feel like something was off. As they sat around the fire, she swore she saw something moving between the trees, a shadow, slipping through the darkness. But when she focused, there was nothing there. She shook it off, telling herself it was just a trick of the light. But deep down, she couldn't shake the sense that they were being watched. The group decided to keep the spooky vibes going by telling ghost stories around the fire. The laughter and scary tales filled the night air, but as the hours passed, the forest around them seemed to grow quieter. It was as if the trees were listening, waiting. At first, the others laughed it off, but then they heard it to a faint, disembodied whispering coming from somewhere in the trees. It was too quiet to make out any words, but it was clear that it wasn't just the wind. The whispers seemed to circle them, moving from one side of the campsite to the other. Unease began to settle over the group as they tried to pinpoint where the sound was coming from, but no matter where they looked, they decided it was just their imaginations playing tricks on them and headed to bed. But sleep would not come easy that night. Just as they were about to drift off, the whispers returned, this time, clearer and much closer. Jake sat up, his heart racing as he listened. It was no longer just random sounds now. It was unmistakably a voice, low and hushed, whispering his name, Jake. "Come out, Jake," whispering. "Did you hear that? Someone's out there, calling my name." Chris nervous. "No way. Man, you're imagining it?" Jake wasn't imagining it. They both heard it, the voice, barely more than a breath, repeating his name over and over. But the scariest part was how it sounded, like someone was right outside the tent, whispering directly into his ear, even though there was no one there. "Let's just get out of here. I don't care if it's the middle of the night, I'm not staying another minute." They decided to break camp and hike back to their car in the dark, but as they packed up, the whispers grew louder, almost mocking them. Every time they looked over their shoulders, they caught glimpses of movement, shadowy figures darting between the trees, always just out of sight. As they made their way through the dark woods, the whispers followed them, growing more insistent, more aggressive. What started as a distant murmur had become a cacophony of voices, all whispering their names, urging them to stray from the path. Jake's blood ran cold as he saw a shadowy figure standing in the middle of the trail, hunched over with unnaturally long limbs and eyes that glowed faintly in the dark. It didn't move or speak, just stood there, watching them as the whispers swirled around them like a storm. For what felt like an eternity, they stared at the figure, too scared to move. But then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it melted into the shadows, disappearing as if it had never been there. The whispers, however, remained, taunting them all the way back to the car. They made it back to the car just as the first light of dawn crept through the trees. None of them spoke on the drive home, too shaken by what they had experienced. Even now, they can't fully explain what they saw or heard that night. But one thing is certain, the shadows in that forest weren't just tricks of the light, and the whispers weren't just the wind. Some places in the wild hold secrets, things best left undisturbed. So, if you ever find yourself in a remote forest, and you hear your name whispered from the shadows, do yourself a favor and don't listen. You never know what might be calling to you from the dark. Story number 4. Mark loved the solitude of camping alone. He often ventured into the deepest parts of the forest, far from any trails or campgrounds, seeking the peace that only isolation could bring. But on this particular trip, something would find him instead. After hours of driving, Mark found the perfect spot, a secluded clearing beside a calm lake. He set up his tent, made a fire, and settled in to enjoy the quiet. But as night fell, that peaceful silence became something else, something oppressive. The first sign that something was wrong came in the form of complete and unnatural stillness. The crickets, the frogs, even the rustle of leaves, all the usual forest sounds were gone. It was as if the entire world was holding its breath. Mark felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. Every time he looked into the darkness beyond the firelight, he thought he saw movement, quick flashes of something darting between the trees. Too fast to be human. He decided to clear his head by taking a walk down to the lake. But as he stared out at the water, he heard a faint splash. Looking around, he saw nothing, but the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. Then, in the reflection on the lake's surface, he thought he saw something, a figure standing on the opposite shore, barely visible in the mist. The figure vanished as quickly as it appeared, leaving Mark wondering if he had imagined it. But deep down, he knew something was wrong. The urge to pack up and leave gnawed at him, but he convinced himself it was just nerves. He decided to sleep it off, hoping the morning would bring clarity. As the night dragged on, sleep refused to come. Every creak, every rustle outside his tent sent Mark's heart racing. Then, just as he was beginning to drift off, he heard something unmistakable: footsteps. Slow, deliberate, circling his tent. The footsteps stopped directly in front of the tent, just inches away. Mark held his breath, too terrified to move. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence, and then he heard a voice, faint, distant, like a whisper carried on the wind, but clear enough to make out. "Come outside." Gathering all the courage he had, Mark unzipped the tent a crack and shone his flashlight outside. But there was nothing, no one standing there, no footprints in the dirt, just the empty clearing, bathed in moonlight. But the whispering continued, growing louder, as if it was coming from everywhere at once, against every instinct telling him to stay put. Mark stepped outside. The whispering was closer now, and more voices had joined in, all urging him to come deeper into the forest. He shone his flashlight toward the trees, and for a split second, he saw them, figures, dozens of them, standing just beyond the light's reach, their eyes glowing faintly in the dark. Panicking, Mark dove back into his tent and sealed it shut, clutching a knife as if it could protect him from whatever was out there. He spent the rest of the night wide awake, listening as the whispers grew louder, echoing around his campsite. But the figures never came closer, they just circled the tent, waiting, watching. At first light, Mark wasted no time packing up. The whispers had finally stopped, and the forest had returned to its usual sounds, as if nothing had happened. But as he prepared to leave, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. His gear had been moved. The tent stakes had been pulled up, and the firewood he'd gathered was scattered across the clearing. Something or someone had been in his camp while he slept, tampering with his things. It was no longer just paranoia. He was certain now that he had been stalked, played with by whatever lived in those woods. Without looking back, he grabbed his gear and ran, the sense of being watched following him all the way back to his car. He didn't stop until he was miles away, back on the main road. Only then did he allow himself to breathe. But even as he drove away, he couldn't shake the feeling that the whispers were still with him, like they had clung to him, waiting for another chance. Some places are meant to be left alone, forgotten by time. Mark never returned to that forest, and he warns anyone who'll listen to stay far away from those cursed woods. The whispers he heard weren't just in his mind, they were a warning, and he barely escaped with his life. So, if you ever find yourself camping deep in the forest and you hear someone calling your name, don't follow the voice. It might be the last thing you ever do. Story number 5. Tom and Eric were avid campers, always looking for new, unexplored places to pitch their tents. They had heard rumors about a forest far off the beaten path, where very few people ventured. Locals avoided it, claiming it was haunted, but the two friends scoffed at such tales. They saw it as the perfect challenge. They arrived late in the afternoon, ready to hike into the heart of the forest. The air was thick and humid, the trees so dense they blocked out most of the daylight. But Tom and Eric were excited, eager to reach the spot they had picked out on the map, a clearing deep within the woods that looked like the perfect campsite dot as they hiked. The forest began to feel wrong. The trees seemed to close in on them, their branches gnarled and twisted like skeletal fingers. Occasionally, they spotted strange carvings in the bark symbols they didn't recognize, as if someone or something had been marking the path. But they pressed on, ignoring the growing sense of unease. By the time they reached the clearing, the sun was setting, painting the sky in deep reds and purples. They quickly set up their tents and got a fire going, feeling a bit more at ease. But as night fell, that creeping dread returned. The forest seemed to quiet. No animal sounds, no rustling leaves, just a heavy, oppressive silence. As they sat by the fire, Tom swore he heard something, faint voices whispering just beyond the ring of light. At first, he thought it was the wind, but when he looked at Eric, he saw that his friend had gone pale, his eyes wide with fear. Eric had heard it too, a low, murmuring chant, like a distant conversation carried on the breeze. "Do you see that? There's something out there?" They both saw it, quick, jerky movements in the darkness, just beyond their sight. Every time they pointed their flashlights toward the movement, it would vanish, only to reappear in another direction. The shadows weren't natural, they moved like people, but faster and in a way that made their skin crawl. The whispering grew louder, no longer distant. Now it was all around them, circling the campsite, but there was no one there. The voices were unintelligible, like multiple people talking at once, overlapping in a low, droning chant. Tom and Eric were on edge, but leaving in the dark felt even more dangerous. They decided to wait until morning to pack up and get out. Inside the tent, the whispers continued, rising and falling like waves, sometimes fading to almost nothing, only to surge back louder than before. Eric clutched a knife while Tom gripped a flashlight, both of them too scared to sleep. Then, just as the whispers seemed to be dying down, they heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps outside the tent. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, crunching over the leaves and twigs just outside. Whatever was out there circled the tent, stopping every few feet as if it was listening. Then, the tent fabric rustled, as if someone was dragging their hand along it, feeling for a way in. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, all was still. But then, there was a knock, soft, deliberate, like someone tapping on the fabric 3 times, then silence. Tom and Eric didn't move, barely even breathing as they stared at each other in horror. Who or what would be out here, knocking on their tent in the middle of the night? The knocking started again, this time from the other side of the tent, then from behind, then back to the front. It was as if whatever was out there was toying with them, taunting them. The whispers returned, louder now, overlapping with the knocks, creating a maddening chorus of sounds. Somehow, they made it through the night. As the first rays of sunlight broke through the trees, the noises stopped. The forest came back to life with the usual morning sounds, birds chirping, leaves rustling as if the horrors of the night had never happened, shaking. Tom and Eric packed up as quickly as they could, desperate to leave, but just when they thought they were safe, they saw it. Ahead of them on the trail, in the clearing where they had camped the night before, was another campsite, an exact replica of theirs. The same tent, the same fire pit, even the same arrangement of their belongings. But it was empty, untouched, as if it had been there for years. They couldn't believe what they were seeing. The tent was identical to theirs, down to the smallest detail. Even the markings on their gear were exactly the same. It was as if their entire campsite had been copied and left behind as a ghostly reminder of what happened there. The air grew cold, and the whispering started again, faint and mocking. Terrified and confused, they ran the rest of the way back to their car and sped away, vowing never to return. To this day, they can't explain what they experienced, and they haven't told many people out of fear that no one would believe them. But one thing is certain, they encountered something in that forest, something that could twist reality itself. Some places are more than just haunted. They're traps, luring in those who dare to explore them. Tom and Eric barely escaped, but the memory of that night and the sight of their ghostly doppelganger campsite haunts them still. So, if you're ever tempted to camp in an unfamiliar forest, be careful where you set up. You might not be the first, and you might not be alone. Story number 5. Jason and Sarah had been planning this camping trip for months. They loved exploring secluded spots where they could enjoy nature without any distractions. They had found a remote section of forest where very few people ventured, and it seemed like the perfect place to unwind. But they would soon wish they had never found it. After a long hike, they finally arrived at a small clearing. It was peaceful, surrounded by thick trees with no signs of other campers. They set up their tent, gathered firewood, and looked forward to a night of relaxation under the stars. But as the sun began to set, an uneasy feeling crept in. Everything seemed perfect at first, but as the darkness settled in, the atmosphere changed. The usual sounds of the forest crickets, frogs, rustling leaves faded away. Instead, there was only silence, heavy and suffocating. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath. Jason heard something, a faint rustling, like someone moving through the underbrush. But when he pointed his flashlight into the trees, there was nothing there. Sarah brushed it off as an animal, but Jason couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. They decided to call it a night, retreating into their tent. But sleep didn't come easily. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional creak of a tree or the snap of a twig. Jason lay awake, convinced that something was moving outside. Then, just as he began to drift off, he heard footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling the tent. The footsteps were unnervingly steady, like someone pacing around the campsite. Jason's heart pounded in his chest as he held his breath, listening. He hoped it was just a deer or some other animal, but deep down, he knew better. The footsteps weren't random, they were deliberate, like someone was walking in a perfect circle around their tent. Suddenly, the footsteps stopped. For a long moment, there was only silence, but then a new sound emerged. It was a soft scraping, like fingernails dragging along the tent fabric. Jason felt a chill run down his spine as the scraping continued, moving slowly from one side of the tent to the other. Whatever it was just inches away. "Come out. I see you." They heard a voice, low and raspy, barely more than a whisper. It came from just outside the tent, sending a surge of terror through both of them. The voice repeated itself, taunting them with the same chilling words, "Come out. I see you." They were frozen, too terrified to even breathe. Who or what was outside? It didn't make sense. They were miles from the nearest road, and they hadn't seen another person since they arrived. The voice circled the tent, whispering the same phrase over and over, its tone growing more insistent with each pass. Finally, after what felt like hours, the voice stopped. They listened as the footsteps moved away, deeper into the woods. But just when they thought the nightmare was over, they heard something else, a crackling sound, like a fire being lit in the distance. But they hadn't started a new fire, and there were no other campers around. As soon as the first light of dawn broke, they grabbed their gear and bolted out of the tent. But as they packed up, they noticed something horrifying just a few yards away. Hidden behind the trees was a small fire pit they hadn't noticed before, and next to it was something that sent shivers down their spines. Next to the fire pit was a pile of sticks, arranged into a rough human shape, and next to that was an old backpack, half buried in the dirt, withered by years. Next to the fire pit was a pile of sticks, arranged into a rough human shape, and next to that was an old backpack, half buried in the dirt, withered by years of exposure. The journal was filled with frantic, almost illegible writing, but one phrase stood out, repeated on nearly every page. "Don't listen to the voice. It's not human." Terrified, they left everything behind and sprinted back to their car. They drove away without looking back, vowing never to return to that forest. To this day, Jason and Sarah don't know who or what was out there with them that night, but they're convinced that the voice they heard wasn't from anything human. Something in that forest was watching them, waiting for the right moment to strike. and if they had stepped outside the tent when it called, they might never have made it out. Story number 6. Chris, Mike, and Jenna were experienced hikers and campers, always eager to explore new and isolated places. They had planned a weekend camping trip deep in the forest, far from any established trails. For them, the more remote the location, the better. But this time, their love for isolation would lead them somewhere they wished they had never found. After hours of hiking, they found a clearing nestled between towering trees. The place was perfect, no one around for miles, just nature and solitude. They quickly set up camp and settled in, eager to enjoy the peace and quiet. But as night fell, they would soon realize that they were not as alone as they thought. As they sat around the fire, the mood slowly changed. The air grew colder, the darkness seemed thicker, and the forest grew eerily silent. No animals stirred. No wind rustled the leaves, just an oppressive, unsettling stillness. They tried to brush it off as their imaginations running wild, but deep down, they knew something wasn't right. Jenna was the first to hear it, a faint creaking sound, like wood bending under pressure. Chris and Mike shrugged it off, assuming it was just an old tree swaying in the wind. But Jenna couldn't shake the feeling that the noise was coming from something else, something man-made, like a door opening. Curiosity got the better of them, and they decided to check it out. Armed with flashlights, they ventured into the forest, following the strange creaking noise. The deeper they went, the thicker the trees became, until the moonlight barely reached the forest floor. Then, through the shadows, they saw a dark silhouette of a cabin, hidden among the trees. They couldn't believe what they were seeing. The cabin looked ancient, as if it had been abandoned for decades. Its roof was sagging, the windows were shattered, and the wooden walls were covered in moss and rot. But the strangest part was that the front door was slightly ajar, creaking in the wind. Someone or something had been there recently. Against their better judgment, they decided to explore the cabin. Chris slowly pushed the door open, revealing nothing but darkness inside. The smell of damp wood and decay hit them like a wave, but curiosity pushed them forward. They stepped inside, their flashlights cutting through the gloom, revealing old furniture covered in dust and cobwebs. But it was what they found on the floor that made them wish they had never entered. The floor was covered in strange symbols carved into the wood, circles, triangles, and jagged lines that made no sense. In the center were the remains of melted candles, arranged in a ritualistic pattern. The sight sent chills down their spines. This wasn't just an abandoned cabin, it was a place where something dark had taken place. Jenna found an old journal on a table, its pages yellowed with age. She hesitated before opening it, but her curiosity got the best of her. The writing was barely legible, scrawled in frantic handwriting, as if written by someone in a state of panic. It detailed the last days of someone who had been living in the cabin, or trapped there. The entries were disturbing. They described hearing whispers at night, voices that seemed to come from the forest itself. The writer talked about seeing shadows moving just beyond the tree line, watching them through the windows. Each entry became more erratic, until the final one simply said, "It's inside now. I can't leave." After that, the writing stopped. They had seen enough and decided to leave, but as they turned to go, a loud crash echoed from the back of the cabin. It sounded like something heavy had fallen or been thrown. Panic set in, and they ran for the door, not daring to look back. But just as they reached the threshold, they heard a faint whisper coming from the darkness behind them. They ran as fast as they could, tearing through the underbrush back toward their campsite. But the whispers followed them, growing louder and more insistent, like a voice right behind them. It was only when they reached the clearing that the sound stopped, leaving them in terrified silence. They didn't waste any time packing up. The sun was rising as they made their way back to the car, eager to leave the forest behind. But just before they reached the trailhead, they noticed something in the distance, a figure, standing at the edge of the trees, watching them. It was too far away to make out any details, but they knew one thing for certain: it wasn't one of them. To this day, none of them know who or what that figure was. They've never returned to those woods, and they don't talk about what they found in that cabin. But they're convinced that whatever haunted that place wasn't done with them, and that it's still out there, waiting for the next curious souls who stumble across it. If this story sent chills down your spine, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more spine-tingling true stories. And remember, sometimes, the things left abandoned in the woods were meant to stay hidden.